Okay, so I want to walk you through the next assignment here, which is a video project. It's to make a multimedia project based on the poem that you've selected. And with that poem, it has to be Canadian content. It has to be at least 15 lines long. And you have to do an audio recording of yourself performing it. And we've talked in the past about the difference between reading a poem and performing it, speaking it with emotion and volume and differences in pace, things like that. And if you need a reminder of how to perform a poem, what poetry should sound like and how you infuse emotion into it, on the blog site for this section, there is this video here that is a really good reminder about some of the things to consider when you're preparing to perform your poem. Like, don't do it sitting down, don't record it sitting down, do it standing up because it changes the sound of your voice. You'll move around and use gestures more naturally, which means your recording of this poem will come across more naturally as well. There's also this website here that you can click on. It includes a number of different poems recited by a number of celebrities, and they do a good job of reading it, performing it in a way where that emotion is developed in it. So it's not just a reading of a poem that you'll record, it is a performance. Now, if you recall in previous semesters or classes, when you've had to do this type of work, I've encouraged you to just do a regular reading of the poem as like a base recording. And then do your practicing and practicing and practicing until you think you're all set, and then do your performance recording. And previously, I've asked you to submit both of these to me so that I can easily compare the sound of a recording of you reading the poem versus performing it. But at the grade 12 level, I'm just going to assume that you understand the difference between that. This might be an extra step that's now unnecessary because you're a bit more advanced than that. But if you think it still would be beneficial to you to do just a reading of it, and then for your own benefit, record something that is a greater performance, it's got more variation in the sounds, in the pace, in the pronunciation of words. You maybe emphasize certain words, or you draw out more of the sounds, the consonants, the vowels, the rhyme, that kind of stuff. That's your choice. But for this assignment, I'm really only requiring the performance recording, and it's part of your video. So it's a video project, just to be really clear. It's not just an audio recording. So in the ELA 20 course, there is a dramatic reading that you had to do. That was simply an audio recording. This one here is video project, which means that it does need to include pictures and possibly even video clips, and we'll get to that in a second here. One of the most important parts that I'll focus or mention here as well is that a lot of people, a lot of students, when they submit this assignment, just submit the middle. And the middle is the part that has their poem and the images that they put with it, but they have no beginning. They have no title or page that lists the title of it. There's no few seconds of pause before the actual performance begins. If I pressed play, the video or the sound might start right then and there. So you need a beginning, not just a pause or a moment, so that your performance doesn't start too abruptly. You need a bit of a pause, but you also need to include the beginning credits. What is the title? Who is the person that's narrating it? So if this would be something like a title page, make sure that you include that. And then they often exclude including an ending, which would be something like your credits page. It might even just be a simple slide that says the end. Or you could take it and it could be a bit more developed, and it could say like, references, sources or something like that, and you could list the locations of the images and websites that you got your sound effects from, or something like that, right? But I'm bringing this up at the very beginning here to make it really clear. Avoid this type of a project that you submit, where you only submit the middle part, because the evaluation of this project is really only out of 3 different components. And if you're only including the middle component, you're losing quite a bit of the marks. And so in the end, what's happened is students who've only submitted the middle and skipped doing the beginning and the end have taken their project back, tacked on a beginning, tacked on an end, resubmitted it again, and got a much improved mark. So just avoid having to redo something and just do it properly the first time. Make sure that you're including a beginning and an end. So what I want to go over with you specifically is, so that it's clear, what do I mean when I say multimedia? And it's kind of obvious. It's multiple forms of media that you're putting together, pulling from these multiple forms and layering them together to make this project. So you're including sound, images, and video clips. You could do this project and only include sound and image, and I'll tell you that you'll be successful. You could complete the project just with that, but you won't show any risk taking. It makes the project that you're developing a bit less complex or less developed, which means that the potential mark you'll get from it will be lower. But again, we're getting, time sensitive here, and you might just need this thing over and done with so that you can move on to other stuff. And if that's the case, then you just worry about sound and images. That's perfectly fine. That's your choice. But if you do want to do a bit of risk taking, if you want to extend yourself and do something that's a bit more complex, more challenging as a project, so that it shows that you have kind of stretched yourself by using more of the tools for editing, working with more modes of media sources, you're likely going to get a better mark that way. So I would encourage it, and it's not that complicated to do, depending on your background. So sounds, you would be including things like sound effects. You maybe want some music lightly in the background. The music that you can pick from or select might help you establish the tone. Specifically for this project, since it's about poetry, you would pick things that would help establish the mood that your poem selection creates through the language in it. You also will need your own narration of the poem itself. As far as images go, you might have, you'll pull together a collection of images that you have selected and chosen. You want to pick images that are complementary to each other, and I'll tell you what to avoid. Avoid using images that don't work together. I've had a lot of students that have just done a Google search of like trees or the forest or a river, for example, and they might just select the first 8 images that come up in their Google search, and they'll end up doing a project that includes both photographs, beautiful photographs, as well as cartoons or hand-drawn images or art or things like that. So make sure that you're thinking about that and being really careful in the image selection that you're using, that you pick complementary images back and forth with each other. And the things to avoid in particular, there's 2 major ones. One is avoid watermark images. And you'll see in your handout that it includes that. It would be an image that has a little bit of a shadow within the image, some type of a design or a wording that's stamped across it. And it could be that that stamp is grayed out. It could be that it's bright and white, but just avoid watermark images. And the second thing is avoid overly pixelated images. And what I mean by that, when you're selecting your images, you could use it in your Google search. You could do like an advanced search, and you could look for a certain size. You could look for larger sizes of images, and that way you have a file type that includes a big picture image that's very detailed. And when you use that in your project, it won't be stretched or distorted. But if accidentally you've picked one of the images that comes up in your Google search and you try to include it in your media project, it's going to fit that project into the space like the other ones. And if you have a small file size and it's expanded to fit into the size of your media image, it might overextend the size of that image more so than what the small file size would allow, which means your picture ends up looking pixelated. It's not clear anymore. It ends up looking kind of blurry. So those are 2 things to avoid with that. So that's sound, image, and then you have videos. So you could take, like it could be you look on YouTube and you find some type of a short video clip that somebody's taken. It could be a video clip that's been produced, that it might be part of like a commercial or something like that. It depends on what your topic is and the kinds of video images that you might be looking for. You want, again, the same thing with the images. You want to find video that will complement your poem, that will only enhance it and not distract from your poem. It could be that you find video sources that are sourced online, like I said, produced, or it could just be video footage somebody else has loaded up of, you know, a beautiful sunset or something like that. You could record your own video source and use that. You can decide if you want to use the video with or without the sound, because, and we'll look at the layering part of this later, you have your audio narration of your poem. You might have some background music in the back. You might have some specific sound effects. You might decide that you don't need the audio that accompanies the video that you might choose to use. So those are your three. Multiple forms of media: sound, image, and video. And as far as sound goes, I've posted a bunch of websites on the blog section here that accompanies this project. There are lots of different websites there that you can download sound effects from, or specific music that doesn't have lyrics or singing. It could be just kind of contemporary soft music in the background. Some of them you have to pay for, but depending on what your project is, if you find one that works for you, you should talk to me about that, and we can see. I might buy a subscription to one or two of these websites. So if I've listed it there in the blog post and you found something that you like, you should really talk to me, and I can tell you whether or not I have access to that legally or not, okay? So another part of this project specifically is that you are using a video making software of some sort to do the editing to create this project, right? So whereas in ELA 20 or I think, yes, in ELA 10 as well, you had some different just oral recordings to do. This takes that basic skill and it adds a bit to it, where now you're not just creating your audio recording, but you're also enhancing it and pairing it together as a project with different media types. You're using a video software to edit it, and you're creating something that's a bit more complex. So some of the tools that are available to you through these editing softwares are listed here below. And the reason specifically why I'm mentioning it is because this is 1/3 of your project assignment is going to come from how produced your project is. What tools have you taken advantage of, and how carefully have you implemented them to create this project? And you want to be careful because, yes, all of these tools are available to you, and yes, you're getting marked on your use of them, but you don't also want to overproduce. You don't want to take a 60-second poem that's narrated and include so much extra content into it that it's distracting from the poem itself. So you want to be cautious and selective, but use the tools that are available to you to enhance the poem that you're trying to represent. And this is a representation project. It's meant to be creative because there's all sorts of techniques and ways that you can implement these things to create something that's truly unique for you. So some examples of the tools that you have: you've got background colors for the slides that you might have. Your title page doesn't necessarily have to be black. It could be something else. It could be an image behind your title, that kind of stuff. Some programs will have you, create the video, but then that video is embedded into a colored background screen or something like that. So the background slides are one part of that. There are transitions that you can implement, you can use between the images and video slides, which just means as it goes from one image and moves on to the next, those transitions you can include, like it might fade out and then come out, fade in. It might fan out, it might pixelate out. There's those kinds of transitions that you can use. You'll also want to consider the duration of the images. So you'll have to take the audio length that you have. You'll have to decide if you want a pause or any music or sound effects before that. So you have to get a sense of the actual duration of the sounds that you have, and then you'll start fitting in the images that you have along with the video that you might have, and then you need to kind of make those decisions, especially timing. Timing is something I didn't include in here, but I should write it in as well. You might decide that as you're narrating the poem, you'll go along with, you'll press play with the poem recording in your video editing software, for example, and you might decide that this picture should last until the end of a certain stanza. So this picture may end up being 10 seconds long, while the next one might be 6, because it goes towards, until the end of a couple lines in the poem. So the timing of your images and video to go along with the speaking momentum and rhythm of the poem that you're narrating, that's something else that's part of that. But it's not just the duration of your images, you also have to take into account the duration of the time between each image. And so something like this is also important. You don't want it to be too quick, because let's say that you have a somber, quiet type of poem, but your transitions quickly switch from one to the next, like 3 seconds. That counterbalances the kind of calm and quiet rhythm that you want to create of your poem. So you have to think about some of these things together: the duration of your images, the duration of your transitions, the timing that you pair these images together with, the spoken rhythm and sections of the poem that you've chosen. That stuff's all really important. And this shows the skill. However you work with this, whether you're a bit lazy in piecing things together to create a certain rhythm or precise, overlay of a certain sound, or the length of something to match the timing of your speaking, stuff like that, would show that you've taken more time, you're developing and demonstrating more skill, which will reward you with a higher mark. So that's something to consider. You also, as far as tools go, continuing on here, you have a title page and end credits, and I've got a star there. Like I said, a lot of people will skip this or miss it. It could mean as much as 25% of a mark being missing, just because you didn't take what might be 3 minutes worth of time to add in here a beginning and an end, if you recall. There's also text that you can include. So if you have a title page, you'll type in there maybe your name, the title of the poem. Remember that poems should have quotation marks around them, capitalized the first letter of whatever the poem is. You can recall as well, and I'll just throw this out there, that if you have a poem that's longer in length, you might reference the title as it's written on the page. That should give you an indication of what should be capitalized or not capitalized. Your first letter of the whole thing should obviously be capitalized, and then you'd have smaller letters here. If your next letter is short, 3 letters long or less, it would just be small letters. But if additional words within that title are 4 letters long or longer, you would capitalize them. So this is the same approach that you would use for writing out or creating original titles for your essays, right? It's the habit that you understand that your first word in a title is always capitalized, and then if it's 4 letters long or longer, those ones get the capital as well, okay? So text boxes, it's also the font type that you use. Are you going to use something that's difficult for someone to read? Are you going to pick colors of font? Let's say you pick a green font and you lay it over top of a green background. Well, that's going to be difficult to read. So again, it's your choices in the development of this stuff that will be evaluated, right? Image and video filters. There's also filters that you can overlay over a whole project, over certain images. Again, depending on the mood or topic of your poem, you might want to make your whole thing black and white. You might want to make some black and white. You might want to make it seem older. There's that type of a filter overlay that you can include as well. You will also want to consider whether you use a variety of filters or all the same for some consistency in this finished product. I'll just repeat that these are tools that you can use, but overuse of them leads to a product that looks immature. Like, for my personal preference, and I am the one that's evaluating this, Someone that uses a different transition between every photo is a distraction for me from what the focus is, because in something like this, you're trying to create polish. You're not trying to experiment and show variety. You want a polished, established project here. And so a uniformity, a consistency helps go along with that type of selection process. There's also, depending on the video project that you use, something like pan and zoom, where at times your image will zoom in to a certain area of a picture, and then it'll slowly, as the next slide comes along, it'll zoom back out and expand. So that's pan and zoom. You also have control over the volumes. So some sounds you want to be lighter because you only want them to enhance your poem's narration. You might want to have some sound effects or some background music that starts off your project and just kind of has a moment of quiet music or something like that to establish a tone, and then it might fade down to a second volume level that's lower, so that your narration, when it starts, can be heard evenly. There's such a thing as the fade in and fade out tools as well, so those are different things that you can use to focus on that. If I'm looking over here on the right side of things, when I'm evaluating your technique, these are some of the characteristics of the video project stuff that you should consider. So consider these characteristics. As you create your project, you'll make decisions, and they'll relate to a number of these techniques or methods, right? So volume, you want to consider that you'll have an appropriate volume for everything that you've layered over. You want the volumes of your audio sources to complement each other, not to overpower. So you don't want to have a really quiet background music to start a poem, for example, and then when your audio narration starts playing, it suddenly jump in volume and be quite loud, and then you can no longer hear the background music or things like that. I should be able to play this program as well and not have to adjust my sound to bring it way up or take it way down. You want to adjust your volume to be appropriate for whoever's listening. The volume fading I talked about, so consider when you want things to get louder or softer, and the different volumes of the different layers, overlayers. You want to consider speed. So like I mentioned over here, the duration of your images, the duration of your transitions, the timing that you pair up images, transitioning at certain times or intervals of the spoken poem, that stuff's to be considered. But as well, the speed. So if you have a kind of exciting, bright, kind of playful poem, you might want a quicker developed transition or pace in your poem. So quick transitions could give the impression of a more intense or energetic tone, but slower developed transitions between images or longer time for the images themselves can help develop a more somber tone. So a bit slower pace, that rhythm that you want to establish. So the speed of things also needs to be considered. For effect and creativity, you can use pauses or the abruptness of audio, for example. We were playing around with another grade. We were playing around with sound effects and stuff like that. And what we did is at the very beginning of a poem narration, they had a sound effect or background music, and the background music intensified and built up until just a real abrupt end. And then there was just a moment's pause, and then there was her audio, and it just was really abrupt and said, "Ugly. Your daughter's ugly." And it led into this other, her poem eventually. But that beginning, that unique way of beginning her project, to have some type of music and build up a crescendo, for example, and then have a really abrupt end and a moment's pause to give emphasis and have a real strong impact to the beginning of that poem narration, was a really unique way of doing that. So for yourself as well, consider, what are some of the techniques that you can use, including pauses? You might have your whole poem project that you're maybe narrating, so spoken language and dialogue, but you might just create a moment within the middle of your poem to pause it, and this might be where your video goes. and you might just have some quiet music or the sound effects of a paddle through water or something like that, and then have your poem continue on following that. You can have a pause in the middle of something if you think it can be done for effect, right? The same thing can go, what could you do or might you do at the end of your poem so that it's not just end of speaking and the music fades out and then the video is done. Like there's just different techniques that you can creatively think about. How might I want to piece this together? What could be a unique way to represent this whole story, implementing all these different tools? What kinds of variety might you decide for your transitions? Like I mentioned before, some people will use a number of different transitions each time. My personal opinion with that is that it can end up being distracting. If you're looking to create something that's a more formal, polished, it looks more skilled and put together carefully, you would have some type of a uniformity. A routineness to it. So for example, I've done the grad videos. I've always used a uniform, consistent type of transition because it's not to be distraction. It's just there to include the transition, but it's done and is consistent, right? The beginning and end of your poem, like I said before, I shouldn't press play and all of a sudden right at the very beginning have speaking and the file ends after the very last word is said. Some people have completed their projects and submitted them like that, where I press play and the speaking starts and I don't have to press stop because the video just ends abruptly. You want a beginning, you want an end. Even if it's some silence. So you might create an image slide, for example. This could be just a blank screen, and you might set the duration at 3 minutes, for example, just so that you have a moment before the narration begins, and then you might copy it and put it at the end. So there's just a moment before the file has quit playing. So you can think about that as well. But the rule of thumb, and I'll be really clear about this, my advice to you though is that less is more. Do not overproduce your project. Don't try to include a lot of everything. Use the tools that are available to you for specific purposes and use them carefully, sparingly, to create something that is a unique and creative project. I would describe using these kinds of tools and techniques and methods kind of like using salt and pepper. You can use it to improve the taste of a dish, but you don't use it to flavor your dish, for example. So don't overuse it. Use these things sparingly. So if I then start looking at how you might start piecing this whole project together, I'm just going to do it by drawing it out, for example. So you're going to have two different parts. You're going to have your audio part, and then you're going to have your images and video part. So I'm going to start with the image and video part because in a video making project, you can't produce just audio alone. You need to have at least an image that you attach the audio to. And just for your sake, I'm going to remind you that you should start off with a title page, and then we'll know automatically that you should have a credit page at the end or an end page. And again, depending on the project that you're using, it really is just the process of adding things. So you might add an image and add an additional image. You want to consider the length of your poem. Some poems were a bit longer. You might have a poem that's 2 minutes long. You don't want 10 photos in that because they'll go by too quickly, right? You instead might want something like 6 to 8, depending on the length of your poem, right? So these are things to consider here. Image, 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 video. This is just as an example. Like that, okay? Title page is really important. Credit page is really important. Another thing to point out here is that with all of these pluses, you can include transitions here. The transitions go between your images. So that'll go the whole way through. Transition, 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 transition. And you can be creative in that. I'm not saying that you have to pick the same transition the whole way through. You might go back and forth between 2 or 3 types of transitions that are similar in their method. You also have to set the duration of the transitions. So you can do it so that, depending on how you want it to work, you might want some of this to go along with stanza 1 of your reading, and then a different set of pictures and transitions to go along with the second stanza. Your poem may not be uniform in its length per stanza. So you might decide, if I'm creating a list of things to consider, so this one here is about the number of photos. Your options here for deciding timing. One of your options might just be the length of the audio, and I'd say your beginning and end moments or pauses if you have them. Take the whole length time and then divide it by, the number of images or slides that you have, so that everything is just even. That's one way to do it. That's the simpler way to do it. The additional way of doing it is take the length of the audio and set the time or duration of slides and transitions to match with poem parts, right? So you might have some images and pair them up with, for example, stanza 1, and you might have a pause, and then stanza 2. But for example, stanza 1 might be 45 seconds and stanza 2 might be 30 seconds, so you can't do them evenly or balance them out. You have to just adjust your time per image to go along with fitting in that, and your time per image fitting in this, right? This one here is a more complicated way, but your product, your end result, will be a more polished project. So we've talked about the beginning and the end slides. You've got the middle, you've got transitions. You also have to set a duration, like we were just talking about. You need to set a duration per image. You might have to cut, trim the video length, things like that to consider. Along with your images, you have to consider if you're going to use a filter. Filters can go both over images and over video. Again, avoid things that will be distracting, but you can use some filters sparingly. That certainly is an option for you. So that's the stuff to consider with your video image. And it just takes a bit of playing around with things. But then the second part that goes along with that, and that's the order that I would do things as well, is I would just kind of piece together, almost like you're about to do some kind of a craft activity. Just put everything in there and then come up here next and add in your audio files. So as an example, let's just say I'm going to include, this is maybe my audio here. Let me just take this as a big, this might be my poem narration, and just bear with me with the colors. This here might be my pause at the beginning and end. This here might be a sound effect that I'm going to throw in there. This one here might be another sound effect that I'll throw in there. I might have some background music playing lightly in the background. So then if I go back to this, this is my audio narration. This is my pause at the beginning. It could be silence, or it could be a sound effect already. It could be silence with the background music. And with my background music, I would add in here a fade in. So it would start off softer and it would get a bit louder. And I would include here a fade out so that it would come back down again towards the end. I might also do the same thing here, have a moment of silence. And you can do that because of the slide that you're using. For example, it would be the duration of this slide here might be where my silence goes, or silence there but the music here. I might have here and here my sound effects. And again, I might do the fade in, fade out, so that it's a gradual, it's not abrupt. You could decide that you want to include a pause in the middle of everything. So there could be a moment here where I create a pause, and there might just be my music running in the background, or I might have an additional sound effect here. And then my poem narration comes back up again. That's the kind of stuff to consider. So start off, number one, by adding in your images and credits. You can throw your transitions in there, but you haven't played around with the duration of anything just yet. Then I'd put in your audio recording of your narration. Throw in some background music if you choose to use it. Make sure that you have a duration, if it's silence that you want to begin things, or a sound effect that will start off at the beginning to kind of set the tone of your poem. That will go in before your audio narration. You might have something that continues on at the end. Your sound effects to play with and to overlay, to time it, so that the sound effect goes right over top of a certain image, for example, or goes along with a certain part of the poem, you know, certain lines of the poem, that kind of stuff. And this is where you demonstrate your skill, right? How precise are you going to be with it? What kinds of tools are you going to use? How will you implement them? Your just design decisions. And all of this, you could have great ideas for what to develop. And the truth is that you may be really crunched for time. And I understand that. So in the end, you might just piece something together and get a satisfactory mark, and then you move on to the other work that you have to complete, because completion is important as well. I hope that all of this has kind of been a helpful overview. It really depends on each of your individual backgrounds related to developing multimedia projects. So you can also look on the blog post here with this. I've included 3 different student examples. They've all done a bit of a different thing in developing it. You can double check that they've included a beginning and an after. So a beginning slide, like you can see with this one here, there's a beginning slide. I can't remember if they all included end credits. I think they did. One of them, the first one up here, included some video as well as many different sound effects. This person, the very first video here, got a really, really great mark. So if you're aiming for a great mark and you have the time to put into this project, you'll look at this one here and see it as a really substantial sample of what your video project could be, and hopefully find that any of these 3 can give you inspiration in that. And aside from that, ask questions if you need any help with anything. Remembering that if you go back to the homework blog, in our section, we're in the B9s, this this section here about sound layering, the supports for the video projects. If you click on that, there are a number of links there to the websites that you can use to get sound effects. So there's freesound.org, SoundSnap, Epidemic Sound, MusicBed has a lot of great music. You can see by the image here that you can just pick music by the mood. So depending on the mood that you identify for your poem, you can pick music related to that. And some of the music you'll see, it'll have an X over the microphone or something like that, and you'll know that it's instrumental. Some of these, like I said before, there is a cost to them, so let me know if you're interested in some of that stuff, because we could get a school account. You're allowed, I think it's unlimited numbers of downloads, and there's over 18,000 song titles that you could pick from just for background music, things like that. There's iMovie to use as a program. There's Animotica. There's even on SoundSnap, there's a Canadian Sounds page that you can pull stuff from, so that's kind of comical. And at the bottom here, it shows you how to share your video. Make sure that you share a completed video that's been rendered and all of your audio pieces and files are spliced together in a video project that can then be watched off of your device, because some people mistakenly send me their project, and I can't play a project unless it's on the device that all of those files are separately contained in. So make sure that you go through the process to save it as a video. If you're using the Animotica program, it goes through and shows you at the end here in the bottom right corner to save your video, save it as, make sure that you've renamed your file properly so that your name is included in it, and it should be an MP4 file or a MOV file, but it shouldn't be MP3, which would be audio only. So again, all these are intended to be helpful, and if you don't need to use them, then just go ahead and do what you think you know how to do, and I'm here to help. Good luck.